Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something that's got you thinking, these Chinese naval exercises that have all put Australia and New Zealand on edge. And you've given us a lot to work with, news articles, expert opinions, even a whole timeline.
It seems like something's up in the Tasman Sea, and
Yeah, and we're going to figure out exactly what.
definitely a lot of buzz around these drills. And I think it's not just because of their scale, it's the context and what it could mean for the region.
Right, because like having naval drills in international waters, that's, totally legal.
Right.
But the lack of notice and the specific location, it's definitely raised some eyebrows.
Exactly. So let's start with just getting a clear picture of what happened.
Okay.
We're talking about a Chinese naval task group, which, and this is important, included a Renhai-class cruiser. And this is significant because the Renhai-class is equipped with some of the most advanced anti-ship missiles and radar systems in the world. It gives China a very real offensive capability in the region. This task group sailed right down Australia's east coast and conducted live-fire exercises within Australia's exclusive economic zone.
And it's not just theoretical, right? I mean, they even warned a commercial Emirates flight, like a passenger plane, about their live-fire plans, forcing it to divert its course. So
Yeah.
that's pretty unusual, to say the least.
Yeah, it certainly raises questions about the level of communication and consideration involved. So it's no surprise that Australia and New Zealand have expressed concerns, especially given the limited notice they received.
I've got their statements right here. Australia's Defence Minister, Richard Marles, was pretty blunt, saying that, Beijing's explanations for the lack of notice just weren't good enough. And New Zealand's Defence Minister, Judith Collins, called it a wake-up call for her country.
Wow.
That's pretty serious.
It is, especially when you consider the concept of an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ. An EEZ gives a country special rights over the resources within a certain distance of its coastline. So while the Chinese ships technically had the right to be there, conducting these kinds of exercises within Australia's EEZ it's unusual, and it has been interpreted by some as a deliberate show of force.
So what does China have to say about all this?
Well, their response has been, quite different. The Defense Ministry spokesperson, Wu Qian, called the Australian complaints exaggerated and not based on facts. They claim to have issued safety notices in advance.
And China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Guo Jiakun, insisted that the drills were conducted safely and professionally in line with international law. So we've got, two very different narratives here, two very different, interpretations of the same events. It makes you wonder, what's the real story? Like, what are China's motives?
That's the million-dollar question, and thankfully you've provided us with some insightful analysis from various experts to help us understand what might be going on.
Okay, let's dig into that. A lot of the experts we've got here, Colin Coe, Ray Powell, Michael Shoebridge, Jennifer Parker, they all seem to agree that these drills are, at least in part, about power projection. China is kind of flexing its muscles, showing the region on the world that its naval capabilities are growing.
Yeah. And it's not just about, showing off either. There's a strategic element to it. Some analysts argue that this is also about sending a message, specifically to Australia and New Zealand.
You mentioned China testing regional responses earlier. Could this actually backfire on them? Like, if this was meant to intimidate Australia and New Zealand, couldn't it have the opposite effect? Like, push them even further towards, stronger alliances with the U.S.?
That's a very valid point. Yeah, it's certainly a risk for China. These actions could inadvertently strengthen the very alliances they're trying to weaken.
So we've got power projection, sending a message, and potentially testing regional responses. Are there any other interpretations we should be considering?
Yeah, there's also the argument that these drills are kind of a response to Australia's recent moves to strengthen its own military alliances, particularly with countries like Japan and the Philippines.
Right.
Both of which, have their own ongoing disputes with China. It's a complex, web of alliances and rivalries.
So it's almost like China is trying to say, hey, we see what you're doing, and we're not just going to sit back and watch.
Right.
But how does this all fit into the bigger picture? Like, what does it tell us about China's long-term goals in the region?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Because these drills, they aren't just an isolated incident. They need to be seen as part of a broader pattern of Chinese behavior in the South Pacific.
You're talking about their efforts to secure deals with smaller island nations, right? Like something that's been causing a lot of anxiety for Australia and New Zealand.
Exactly. And I think this incident really underscores the challenges they face, trying to balance their economic ties with China and their own security concerns.
It's like walking a tightrope.
Yeah.
They need China as a trading partner, but they also need to be wary of China's growing military assertiveness, I guess, especially so close to home.
Precisely. And remember, we're not just talking about, warships passing through. China has been actively seeking security arrangements with smaller Pacific Island nations, which raises the stakes considerably.
Yeah, it really does. And these moves have real-world consequences. You said earlier that increased Chinese military presence could lead to instability in the region. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure, a greater Chinese military presence could very well lead to heightened tensions and even increase the risk of miscalculation or, unintended escalation. And that uncertainty, that could be paralyzing. It makes it harder for countries to cooperate on, like shared challenges, things like climate change or economic development.
Yeah.
And instead, they end up focusing on bolstering their defenses and preparing for potential conflict.
So what can Australia and New Zealand do in response? I mean, do they just sit back and watch as China expands its influence, or do they push back?
It's a tough question, and there are no easy answers. One option is to strengthen their own military capabilities, both individually and by working with allies who share their concerns. We've already seen some movement in this direction with Australia's recent RUK-US deal with the US and the UK.
Right, that was a big deal. Australia gaining access to nuclear-powered submarines, that sends a pretty clear signal to China that they're serious about defending their interests.
Absolutely. But military power is only one part of the equation. Australia and New Zealand also need to engage, diplomatically, both with China and with the Pacific Island nations themselves.
So it's about building relationship, finding areas where they can agree and trying to, I don't know, manage disagreements in a way that doesn't escalate things further.
Exactly. And it's also about offering those Pacific Island nations a viable alternative to Chinese influence. That means providing economic assistance, development aid, and support for things like climate change adaptation.
In other words, proving they can be reliable partners who are, committed to the long-term well-being of the region. But it's not just about what Australia and New Zealand do, is it? What about the U.S.? They must have a role to play in all of this.
Absolutely. The U.S. has long considered itself the dominant power in the Pacific. And it's unlikely to simply hand over that position to China without a fight. Their involvement adds another layer of complexity to the situation.
It's like watching a huge geopolitical chess game unfold, with everyone making strategic moves and trying to anticipate their opponent's next play. But what are the potential outcomes of this game?
Well, there are a few different scenarios we could see play out. On the one hand, we could see a relatively peaceful outcome where everyone manages to, dial down the rhetoric and find ways to coexist.
That sounds like the ideal scenario, but is it realistic?
It's certainly possible, but there are significant challenges. There's a lot of mistrust on both sides. And the overall, geopolitical trends seem to be pushing towards more competition, not less.
So you're saying we need to consider some, I don't know, less optimistic scenarios as well.
That's right. And one of those less optimistic scenarios involves tensions continuing to escalate. Imagine a sort of slow-burning rivalry where China continues to push the boundaries, perhaps by establishing a permanent military base in the South Pacific.
That would certainly raise the stakes. How do you think Australia and New Zealand would respond to something like that?
Well, it would likely lead to, increased military spending and a strengthening of those existing alliances. The FEUS deal with the US and UK could become even more crucial in such a scenario.
And it wouldn't just be about military might, right? We'd probably see a much more intense, battle for influence in the Pacific, with China and the West competing for the allegiances of those smaller island nations.
Yes, imagine increased economic aid, infrastructure projects, and maybe even diplomatic pressure being used to try to sway those countries one way or the other.
It's a worrying thought. Those Pacific Island nations could end up caught in the middle of a geopolitical tug of war.
Right, with their own interests potentially being kind of sidelined. And this kind of rivalry wouldn't just impact those countries, would it? You're right. It could have ripple effects throughout the entire region, impacting trade, investment, and even political stability.
So we've got this potential scenario where tensions continue to simmer, but what about the, worst case scenario, the one everyone hopes to avoid, a direct military conflict?
It's a chilling thought, but we can't ignore the possibility, however remote it might seem.
It sounds like you're saying, even a small miscalculation or a misunderstanding could potentially spiral out of control.
That's the danger in this kind of environment. And if a conflict were to erupt, the consequences would be devastating, not just for the countries involved, but for, the entire global economy and security architecture.
So we've got these three broad scenarios, right? Peaceful coexistence, simmering rivalry, or, all-out conflict.
And where we end up will depend on a complex interplay of factors: political leadership, diplomatic skill, economic interests, military capabilities, and even public opinion.
It sounds incredibly complex, and with so many variables at play, it's, hard to predict which path we're headed down.
It certainly is. And that's why, it's crucial to understand the nuances of this situation, the different perspectives and the potential consequences. It's not just black and white.
Well said. So, given all this uncertainty, are there any key things we should be watching for, as this situation evolves? Any indicators that might give us a clue as to which path we're headed down?
Yeah, absolutely. One key thing is how Australia and New Zealand respond in the coming months. Do they increase their defense budgets significantly? Do they actively pursue, stronger military alliances? And perhaps even more importantly, how do their diplomatic efforts with both China and the Pacific Island nations evolve?
It's like we're waiting to see what their next move is on that, geopolitical chessboard. How do you think China might react to those moves? I mean, if Australia, for example, does ramp up its military spending, will China see that as a provocation and, respond in kind?
It's certainly a possibility. China might interpret such actions as a direct challenge, right, to its interests, and could potentially escalate its own military activities in the region, as a countermove. Or they might double down on their diplomatic efforts, trying to further isolate Australia and New Zealand, within the Pacific.
And what about those Pacific Island nations? They're really at the heart of this, aren't they? Do you think they'll continue to engage with China, or will they be swayed by, the overtures of Australia, New Zealand, and the U.S.?
That's a really crucial question, and it's difficult to predict. Each of those island nations has its own unique set of priorities, right, and concerns. Some might be more inclined to align with China if, they see it as offering more favorable economic opportunities. Others might prioritize their relationships with Australia and New Zealand, especially if we see China's, growing presence as a potential threat to their own security. And then there's, the role of the U.S., which could be a deciding factor for some of these nations. It's a complex web of relationships and competing interests.
It sounds like predicting the future of the South Pacific is kind of a fool's errand.
Yeah.
But this deep dive has certainly given us a much better understanding of the forces at play. We've gone from those initial naval exercises to a much broader conversation about China ambitions, regional alliances, and the potential for both cooperation and conflict. It's a lot to take in, but it feels important to grapple with these issues, even if there are no easy answers.
I agree. And it's not just about geopolitical strategy or military maneuvers. Ultimately, this is about people's lives, their livelihoods and the kind of future they want to build for themselves and their children.
Well said. So what does this all mean for our listener? The person who brought us these sources and asked us to, take a deep dive into this complex situation. What can they take away from this conversation?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that, the world is becoming increasingly interconnected, right, and complex. What might seem like, a distant event, those naval exercises in the Tasman Sea, can have ripple effects that touch all of our lives in unexpected ways. It underscores the importance of staying informed, of understanding different perspective, and of engaging in, thoughtful conversations about these global issues.
And it reminds us that the future isn't predetermined. The choices we make, both individually and collectively, will shape the world we live in. So let's stay curious, let's stay engaged, and let's work together to build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future for everyone.
Beautifully put. And that, my friend, is the essence of the deep dive. Thanks for joining us.